There's actually a need for a healthy kind of nationalism now, a nationalism which is able to strengthen free countries in the competition they have, both economic and strategic, with Communist China and with a number of other bad actors around the world. So there is a need to advance America first by cooperating with other countries as well. It's not the case that, you could simply maximize America's interest by having absolutely no concern about what's happening in other countries. So in a sense, MAGA is now a global movement. President Trump has lately been in East Asia, and it's the longest trip abroad so far in his second term. It raises an interesting question about whether a nationalist politician, and Trump has described himself as a nationalist, can create a new kind of international coalition. Is it possible to take countries which are looking out for themselves first? So America thinking of itself as an America first country. Trump, of course, has as his slogan, "Make America Great Again." Can other countries, maybe Japan, maybe others in different parts of the world, also have a nationalist program, which many people would think of as being a very selfish program? Can they nonetheless come together for mutual benefit and to create a more secure world and an international order of security that is capable of replacing what has been called recently the so-called liberal international order? Now, many of President Trump's critics, many of the critics of populism and nationalism in the 2020s, are afraid that the fall of the so-called liberal international order will lead to conditions of chaos or perhaps the rise of China as a hegemonic power in international affairs. They think that if institutions such as NATO or the European Union or the various alliances that the United States has in East Asia and elsewhere are not maintained and are allowed to change or even collapse, that this will lead to a new era of aggression from everyone from Russia to China to smaller states as well, perhaps North Korea and others. The fear is that something that had been very successful from the end of World War II until the day before yesterday, an international order that was based on rules in which the United States was sort of the guarantor of security for the entire globe, that this will pass away and will be replaced by something much worse, something that in fact bad actors will find an environment in which they can flourish and easily take advantage of the weakness of their neighbors. Now, a lot of this is built upon a rather rosy view of the past, because in fact, throughout the Cold War, throughout the 1990s and the early 2000s, the United States was embroiled, of course, in a series of wars, a series of hot wars, a series of conflicts, most of which didn't turn out terribly well. So the most successful of these conflicts going back 80 years or so was the Korean War, which ended in basically a stalemate, but it did keep South Korea free, and South Korea was able to flourish thereafter, although defenders of the notion of a liberal democratic international order tend to downplay exactly what the character of South Korea was for decades after it was kept free from North Korea, because South Korea was itself a pro-American dictatorship for a couple of decades after the Korean War. So it simply isn't the case that during the Cold War, especially its earlier phase, that the United States was primarily trying to promote liberal democracy or even capitalism. Instead, what we were doing was basically blocking the advance of communism. And while we succeeded to some degree in Korea, most of the other places where we attempted to block the advance of communism by military power, the results were rather worse even than what we saw in the Koreas. So, for example, of course, the Vietnam War is the saddest case of the United States investing tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives, losing tens of thousands of American casualties, killed, as well as hundreds of thousands of Americans grievously wounded, with enormous costs as well to our Vietnamese allies, only in the end for the communists to succeed in taking control of all of Vietnam. And in fact, the communists are still in control of Vietnam to this day. Communist China is not a country with which we had a large war, but Communist China did in fact lend its weight to a variety of other conflicts that the United States was involved in, such as the Korean War. That's one reason why the Korean War turns out as it does, because the Chinese communists were willing to back the North Korean communists. The Cold War period and the early 21st century were both eras of ongoing conflict. It was not a peaceful liberal international order. It was, in fact, a liberal international order that had to be maintained by force, and oftentimes the United States discovered that even using a great deal of force was nowhere near adequate to create the security conditions that we wanted to see. Hi, I'm Dan McCarthy, the editor of Modern Age. You can find us on the web at www.modernagejournal.com. We have some of the most thoughtful and philosophical conservative essays that you will find anywhere in print or online. Our print magazine is a quarterly, and you should subscribe to it. You can find out how to do so at our website, www.modernagejournal.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, please hit the like button and share it with friends of yours through all the social media, whether it's X or Facebook or Instagram or anything else. The price, of course, of this upkeep of the liberal international order was that the United States wound up getting involved in further conflicts even after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War in Europe. So we saw during the 1990s and the 2000s, during the George W. Bush, and for that matter, George H.W. Bush presidencies, and during the Obama presidency, a number of foreign interventions ranging from the relatively limited First Persian Gulf War in 1991 to the much larger Iraq War of 2003, the invasion of Iraq in 2001, and of course, a series of other interventions everywhere from Haiti to Somalia to Libya, where we overturned the dictatorship of Muammar Gaddafi. And even though these interventions were always promoted as being things that would bring stability and that would bring greater peace and a path towards democracy for the Middle East and other regions, in fact, the result was almost always to create conditions of chaos, civil war, and ultimately very considerable migration flows, refugees, from all of these places where America was fighting wars, supposedly for the liberal international order. These migration flows, these refugee flows, would then go not only to other Middle Eastern countries and other parts of the Islamic world, they would go into Europe as well. The result is that you had a destabilization of the neighbors of many of these countries where the U.S. was fighting wars, and you also had long-term consequences for Europe and its demographics. There is a contradiction, in fact, between those who want in America a very hawkish policy of getting us involved in conflicts all around the world, and those who want America to support a very low level of immigration and don't want to see mass migration, either legal or illegal. Because in fact, anytime you have a significant war and a significant amount of chaos and civil unrest created by attempts at regime change and transformation of regions into models that look like the United States, what you actually get are in fact massive amounts of refugees and massive amounts of migration. So Donald Trump has been consistent in saying that he wants to be less engaged in military conflicts abroad and wants to have less immigration in the United States. Notice, by the way, that there is indeed a certain consistency on both sides of this question. So it made sense that George W. Bush, and for that matter Barack Obama and Bill Clinton, these presidents who believed that practically any country could become just like America if only it overthrew its native dictators, that view, which basically, takes for granted that everyone is prepared to become American more or less immediately, is something that also applies in immigration. It applies in the claim that, we can open our borders and let in everyone, and as soon as a new arrival comes to our soil, they will be ready to become an American citizen, and, assimilation is a process that is absolutely immediate and automatic and stress-free. Well, you can choose one or the other. You can choose to have this view of a kind of whole world that is already America in an embryonic state that just is a kind of latent Americanism that is already global. Or you can have the view that, in fact, people do adhere to their ancestral cultures with a fairly strong degree of loyalty and a fairly strong degree of permanence. Not complete permanence. It can be taken away by conscious assimilation to coming to the United States or coming to other places. But in general, people tend to stick with the cultures and the views of the community into which they're born. And it takes a lot of effort to change that. You can't change it simply by going and overthrowing a dictator in a foreign country. That doesn't automatically make anyone else American. And similarly, you can't change it just by having people physically arrive in the United States as migrants. But this was the assumption that prevailed during the final phase of the so-called liberal international order and under the presidents of the 1990s and the early 2000s. Donald Trump has rejected that, but now the question comes to be, can you in fact have a different kind of international order predicated on more of a sense of nations serving their own peoples first and nations having a much more inward-looking view rather than trying to create a global order that is about expanding the very ideas behind nations to a universal degree. So instead of saying that everyone is an American in prototype already, we are entering a phase of history where people once again say that Japan is Japan, America is America, Argentina is Argentina. The whole world has a already filled-in picture of political identities and of political histories of people in every country, and trying to change those, trying to remake them whimsically, or hoping that the mere advancement of economic progress is going to lead to those cultural changes, and those cultural changes will all head in the direction of becoming exactly like the 20th century America. That's a fantasy that is now dispelled. We now know that, in fact, what Francis Fukuyama had thought of as being the end of history in the 1990s is not the end of history, that, in fact, history continues to occur, not just in the form of events, but in the form of real cultural conflicts and questions that go very deep into the nature of both political community, whether there should be nations or whether there should be something more like a global kind of government, and also religious identity, that you continue to have unbridgeable divides between religions that have very different characters. And for that end, we should keep in mind that many ideologies, including secular ideologies, are in fact a kind of whitewashed theology or whitewashed religion. So some of these conflicts that have been known to Western Europe and that have been known to larger swaths of humanity going back to the 17th century and even beyond, these conflicts never really went away. So you think about the great religious wars of Europe, and you think about the long conflict between Islam and Christianity in Europe and in the Middle East and North Africa. And in fact, even though the tempo of these conflicts has changed, there continues to be not just an immediate amount of friction between some of these different regions and different religions, but an ongoing clash of civilizations, to use Samuel Huntington's term. In order to prevent that clash from being violent, in order to keep it as limited as possible, you have to have a degree of respect for other cultures, but you also have to have overall an enormous amount of respect for your own culture, your own civilization. And you can't expect that everyone in the world is going to adopt your views at some point in the near future. Instead, you have to take care primarily of your own community first, and that includes your own nation state first. So what President Trump is trying to do, and I think he's succeeding in this, is to inspire other countries to think more of their own interests, to think more of adopting a kind of leadership which is going to be right-leaning, right of center, but that will, in fact, have something in common with Donald Trump, even if you are dealing with a coalition of different nationalisms. Now, in Japan, we've just seen the rise to power of a new prime minister, Sanae Takaichi, who is something of a protege of the late Shinzo Abe. And she is very much on not only the conservative wing of her party, but also the more nationalist wing. So she is open to revising or removing Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution. This was the constitution that the United States basically imposed after World War II. Article 9 says that Japan can have defense forces, but can't really have a real military. Japan is not allowed to fully rearm after the Second World War. Now, of course, the Second World War was 80 years years ago, and at this point, no one is really afraid that Japan is going to take over East Asia. Instead, the superpower danger in the region comes from communist China. And it would actually be very useful, not only for the United States, but for many of the countries in East Asia itself, to have Japan become stronger, more militarily capable of projecting power, and therefore capable of acting as more of a counterweight, along with other allies in the region, to the rise of communist China. So there is a need for a certain amount of nationalism, which was a word that, for very good reason, people in Japan, people in Germany and elsewhere were very leery of and considered to be a sign of incipient fascism in the immediate wake of World War II. But there's actually a need for a healthy kind of nationalism now, a nationalism which is able to strengthen free countries in the competition they have, both economic and strategic, with communist China and with a number of other bad actors around the world. And it's important if we could have allies that, instead of depending almost entirely on the United States for their defense, are more capable of defending themselves and more capable not just of being clients or dependents of United States strength, but actual real allies who are capable of lending strength of their own to the strategy of the United States. And clearly there are, shared interests between the United States and many of its traditional allies, including Japan, including our NATO allies in Europe, and friends in many other places all around the world. So it's not the case that in moving away from the liberal international order as it existed in the 20th century, that we're therefore saying goodbye to all of our old allies, and that we're therefore, sort of retreating from the world behind, the walls of Fortress America, as the image is sometimes summoned up and described. No, on the contrary, what we're doing is pursuing America's national interests, but pursuing them with the cooperation of other countries that are friends of ours and that are pursuing their national interests as well. And Trump has given a great example to statesmen and indeed stateswomen like Sanae Takaichi of how to succeed in their own countries. Trump, of course, is a figure of great controversy. He has been, seen as someone who overthrows the norms of American politics, and yet the American people have affirmed their support for the course that Trump has taken. They did that, of course, last year by re-electing President Trump, and they've continued to be quite supportive of Trump, in the first year of his second term. Now, this kind of boldness that Trump has demonstrated has helped to inspire leaders like Javier Milei in Argentina and Takaichi in Japan. It has shown them that, in fact, the things that have been taken for granted for decades in their countries, which have rather more stagnant political cultures, you might say, that the norms and values that have been taken for granted under liberal leadership in Japan and under Peronist, rather socialist leadership in Argentina, these can be overturned, and you can actually make Argentina great again. You can make Japan great again by departing from the failed policies of the last several decades. In the case of Argentina, there has been a great vote of confidence, basically, in President Milei just in the past week or so. In the midterm elections, they have midterm legislative elections in Argentina, much as we have in the United States. In the midterms, Javier Milei's party, which is center-right or right of center, triumphed. It expanded its legislative pluralities in both the lower house and the upper house in a way that really defeated not only the opposition parties, but the critics who said that Milei's very reformist and even libertarian policies, trying to create a more free market environment and a smaller government in Argentina, critics who said that this was going to lead to an electoral backlash have been disproven. And instead, Milei has come out of the midterm elections with a much stronger hand than he had going into it. The United States played a certain role in expressing confidence in Milei. Now, of course, as I mentioned in a previous podcast, this confidence in some cases took a material form, such as a currency exchange where the United States was going to offer $20 billion in U.S. currency, in dollars, in exchange for pesos. The peso was a weakening currency, And this was a way of helping to strengthen Argentina economically in a way that would perhaps help Milei in the midterms. And similarly, there are other deals that Trump has cut, which generally reflect well on Milei, such as allowing more Argentinian beef to be imported into the United States, something which has irritated American cattle ranchers, but that nonetheless is lowering supermarket prices here in the United States, while also giving Milei a victory that he can take to his voters. Now, this is part of a long-term vision of what it means to have an America First policy, because to be America First, you also have to have a certain amount of American leverage in other countries. You have to have America armed with allies around the world who are capable of advancing our interests everywhere from our own hemisphere in the Americas to to East Asia and Europe and the Middle East. So there is a need to advance America First by cooperating with other countries as well. It's not the case that you could simply maximize America's interest by having absolutely no concern about what's happening in other countries, especially in countries that could serve as models for the success of pro-American regimes relative to anti-American regimes in a region like Latin America. And in the case of East Asia, there are these strategic concerns. I mean, think about it. America gets drawn into World War II by Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. That's what actually gets us involved in the Second World War. We continue, not only, was Pearl Harbor was a possession of ours, Hawaii was a possession of ours in World War II. Hawaii was not yet a state during World War II. Now it is a state, one of the 50 states. Hawaii is an integral part of the USA. And Hawaii is, far out there in the Pacific Ocean. And it's a great possession. It's something that gives America a number of deep water harbors that are excellent for stationing a Pacific Navy. But of course, the flip side of that is that Hawaii is so far from the mainland that it's relatively more vulnerable than the continental United States. And then beyond Hawaii, you have other possessions, territories such as Guam, which are more vulnerable yet. And so if there were a rival superpower that had the ability to project its power throughout the Pacific in a way that eclipsed our own naval capacities, that would be something that would be a strategic danger, not only to Guam, but also to Hawaii. Even if there's no scenario in which it seems likely that anyone is going to use a Pacific fleet to invade the continental United States, nonetheless, we are not just a continental power. We're also a power that is in the Pacific in the form of a number of islands which have to be defended. So we have a great deal of concern, not just for trade reasons, but for reasons of our own territorial integrity in making sure that the Pacific Ocean is free and is safe, and that the United States itself is the strongest power in that ocean rather than Communist China. Now, Communist China is pouring an enormous amount of money into building up its navy, and currently it has a navy that is actually larger than our own. However, the United States, in conjunction with other countries that are worried about the rise of Japanese power, the United States in conjunction with other powers in the Pacific and East Asia and the region of Australia, the United States, in conjunction with these other states, is capable of fielding a coalition of naval forces that dwarfs the naval capacity of Communist China. So again, this is something where America's own defense is indeed enhanced by some of these relations that we have with nations such as Japan. And of course, there are economic benefits. There are any number of other boons that come to the United States from having friends in different regions of the country. And to have good friends, you need to have strong friends, friends who are not constantly asking you for money, friends who are not constantly creating a security deficit and security risks for you rather than enhancing your security. You need allies who are capable of standing on their own 2 feet. And that's what Trump is trying to inspire in nations all around the world, including in places like Japan and Argentina. In Japan, you have a political establishment which has been in place almost consistently since the end of the Second World War. Much of the action is in politics in Japan is to be found within the Liberal Democratic Party, the party that has had power in that country for most of the post-war era, rather than in competition between parties for parliamentary seats. And Takaichi is herself a member of the Liberal Democratic Party, but she comes from the Shinzo Abe wing of the party, the more right-leaning wing of the party, and she is, if not a populist necessarily, someone who very much shares Donald Trump's nationalist vision. That can be seen in her views of national defense, the need, she's pledged, for example, to accelerate Japan's spending on national defense, spending some 2% or more of Japanese GDP on defense, which is an increase and a substantial one. She has said that she's going to make that happen much sooner than previous administrations had calculated. Similarly, she is, as I mentioned, in favor of changing the Japanese constitution to allow for Japan to have a greater military force. And she also takes a very critical view of immigration. Japan does not have mass immigration on anything like the scale that the United States and Europe and other allies have had in recent decades. But what Takaichi is trying to do is to prevent immigration from becoming the kind of problem that it is in the West. And so she has taken a very hard line, her government has taken a hard line against immigration within Japan itself, especially illegal immigration. Trump is kind of leading a reorientation all around the world in the way right-of-center parties think. So it's really remarkable to see someone who is caricatured as an isolationist and someone who's seen as a kind of parochial American who, is upsetting the international order. It's very, very funny to see that, in fact, Donald Trump is transforming most of the world, and including, especially our allies, changing their political orientations, making them take their own responsibilities as nation states much more seriously, which is giving rise to various nationalist and populist and, for that matter, sort of, reformist parties, which previously had been excluded from the political establishments in those nations. So in a sense, MAGA is now a global movement. And it's still a movement that is making America great because strong allies make America stronger as well. But it's also making those countries greater as well, giving them a greater sense of political legitimacy with their own people, and also giving them more means to defend themselves and a greater sense of their own national identity and, willingness to provide for their own citizens. This is how, in fact, a nationalist leader like Donald Trump can create an internationalist system. And it's a much stronger internationalist system than the weak one that had prevailed in the final decades of the so-called liberal international order, because that was an order which constantly needed the United States to go around the world fighting wars, which turned out very badly and which led to migration crises all around the planet. That liberal international order was unsustainable, and that's why Donald Trump became president first after the 2016 election. It's why the Brexit, revolution in Britain happened also in 2016. That all around the world, globalization and the liberal international order lost legitimacy, if they ever had it, with the public within different nation states. And instead, there's a need for, strengthening nation states on their own, and then, bringing them together as coalitions with, shared interests on a international level. Donald Trump, of course, is the man who made the art of the deal famous, and he's someone who is capable of, using the art of the deal to create these coalitions of different nationalists. So there's no paradox, really, in having a kind of international nationalism. There's also no paradox in President Trump being aligned with a libertarian leader like Javier Milei, because the nationalist needs of Argentina and the United States in this era are quite distinct. In the case of the United States, we have been a globalized economy to such a point that we started to lose sight of the importance of taking care of our own people, and we had outsourced a great many industries that, in fact, we need for our own national defense and for a high degree of self-sufficiency in the USA. Argentina, on the other hand, has for decades, and again going back all the way to World War II, had a political establishment that is generally Peronist and that has, in fact, a very strong socialist character. And just as we've seen throughout the Latin American region, socialist governments, coming to power on a pretty regular basis. And this has made Latin America much poorer than it needs to be. There was a time when Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world. I mean, before World War II, it was actually richer than many European countries. Argentina should be a top flight power. It's a fairly large country compared to most in the world, and it's a country which is capable of being quite wealthy. But misgovernment over the course of decades has impoverished it, and Javier Milei is trying to change that. In order to change that and get rid of the damage that socialism has caused, it's necessary to embrace much smaller government and to embrace a very free market agenda. Donald Trump himself, of course, is a capitalist of the first order. He is someone who has succeeded in business. In fact, he has succeeded in several different kinds of business, whether in media or in real estate. And Donald Trump is by no means trying to promote bigger government for its own sake or trying to promote, some kind of economic system that isn't capitalism. On the contrary, Donald Trump is trying to make sure that capitalism and the nation state are capable of living together and helping one another. Previously, during the liberal international order, there was a tendency for libertarians and others who wanted to see a universal global market kind of setting the norms for the entire planet. There was a tendency for those people to stress the international and to stress the economic over the political and the national, which resulted not only in a world that actually needed constant policing by the United States, but also weakened the United States, made the United States, on the one hand, responsible for the protection of other nations, while also making the United States more dependent, not only on other countries that are friendly to us, but even on communist China. It made the United States more dependent on the entire world, and especially communist China, for industrial goods of all kinds and consumer goods of all kinds. It weakened our own ability to produce the steel and the ships and the aircraft that we need for our own defense and for the defense of allies. So the liberal international order was a suicide pact, and President Trump has now created a order among nationalists in power throughout a number of friends of ours in Latin America, in East Asia, increasingly in Europe. Giorgia Meloni is a great example in Italy of a populist or nationalist leader from the center-right or right who has succeeded. Meloni is particularly impressive because she has been able not only to win power in Italy, which is one thing, but to retain power. Italy is notorious for its very short-lived governments. It's very hard to keep a political coalition together in Italy. And yet Meloni has been succeeding better than any of her predecessors. And it is because she has rejected a lot of the platitudes of the political establishment and is looking out for Italy first. So Trump has shown the way for leaders in other nations to make their nations great as well. And that is going to then redound to the benefit of the United States in international affairs.